there is a very high likelihood that you cannot return to work after a year. So then there goes your pension that's now affected. And if you can go back to work, then obviously you now can start rebuilding and accumulating on your pension. If you remain on long-term disability, the likelihood that you're going to continue to be employed by that employer is gone. So if you want to think about it that way as a teacher, you no longer have a job with that company. You're yeah, so your pension stops accumulating there based on your income.
Welcome to the Teacher Money Show, the podcast dedicated to helping teachers navigate your unique financial challenges and unlock your financial superpowers. I'm your host, Shaun Morgan, a full-time teacher. That's right, I teach every day just like you, and personal financial coach. And I'm here to help every teacher, whether you're a seasoned teacher looking for fresh insights or a new educator navigating your first paycheck, to have a richer wallet, classroom, and life.
The contents of this podcast are informational in nature and are not legal or tax advice, and neither I nor my guests are engaged in the provision of legal, tax, or any other advice. You should not act upon this information without first seeking appropriate advice from an accountant, financial planner, lawyer, or other professional.
I am super excited to have Tanya here today, Tanya Taylor. She is joining me to have a fun conversation about long-term disability insurance. I know that might not sound like fun to you guys right off the bat, but it's going to be a good conversation today. And just a little bit about Tanya. So with over 2 decades of helping people improve their financial lives, Tanya is on a mission to stop the cycle of poverty and build generational wealth. She's an award-winning author, speaker, and the founder and CEO of Grow Your Wealth, a financial education platform, which empowers women to achieve confidence in managing their finances so that they can retire worry-free. Tanya infuses her knowledge from learning and teaching about wealth building, with her 24 years on Wall Street in banking and insurance industries. She's been featured in publications such as Business Insider and Black Enterprise, sharing her story from an undocumented immigrant as an impoverished Jamaican traveling to the U.S. alone at 16 to capitalize on the opportunity to build wealth and changing the trajectory of her and her family's lives. Tanya's core belief relies on the balance of wealth building and personal goals, in which she continues to jet set the world with more than 60 countries visited. So we've got a very well-versed, very well-traveled guest on today. I'm super excited to talk to her. Tanya, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Shaun. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, let's just dive right on in with explaining what is long-term disability insurance and how and did you become interested in this topic? Why are you interested in this topic?
Yeah, let's talk about it. So I've had long-term disability insurance for quite a number of years. And for those who don't know what that is, long-term disability insurance is a type of insurance that you have or you can purchase that would replace some or all of your income if you were to become disabled. And it is typically offered by employers, but there are many different nuances to it, and each employer may have a different type of policy. So it's incumbent on all individuals to actually understand what their employer offer, because Shaun's policy might be completely different from mine in terms of how much coverage you get if you were to become disabled, the time frame that it takes for that disability to kick in, that income for you to start getting that income, and just how long it lasts. So all those different components are factored in when you think about long-term disability insurance. And I think you asked me why I became interested in it.
Yeah.
So I've never sold insurance because people always ask me that question. I've always been a big proponent of insurance, not just long-term disability. But for me in particular, I always felt like every employer I've worked for, I got 60% coverage of my income, and that did not include bonus. So I knew that if I became disabled and having only 60% of my income and having to pay taxes out of that and medical benefits, I would need more money essentially to cover that gap. And so I purchased that policy. But it became much more personal and real for me 3 years ago when I had a car accident. And suddenly, what was all hypothetical and making sure that I had enough coverage became real in terms of, hey, I now have a disability and this is exactly how it works. And we can get into that as we continue to have conversation.
So you have that firsthand experience of why you need to have this in place. Yeah, so you mentioned you got in a car accident. I'm sure there's many things that can lead to
Yeah.
disability. But I'm just thinking, like, when you think of someone being disabled, like, you often think of like, oh, I can't, do like something like with your hands or like walking around or something like that. Teaching, it is pretty exhausting. You're usually walking around, usually, standing and talking, things like that. How likely is it that a teacher is going to become disabled to the point where
Oh,
they'll be able to do
good
the job?
question. Very good question. And I think that is where a lot of us have this misconception, because disability could mean so much, right? It could be mental. Like, if you have some kind of anxiety, teachers get stressed out, they have a breakdown, and it lasts more than 6 months, that's a disability. Actually, even if it lasts after a couple of weeks, you probably go on short-term disability. And then that could progress into long-term disability. So a disability is not always physical. Obviously, it can be. For me, I am an accountant. I worked in an office. I sat at a desk. I had meetings all day, things of that nature. So when I had the car accident, I was in pain every day. My hand was numb, my foot was numb. This could happen to a teacher. You could have a car accident. The statistics from Social Security is that 1 in 4 individuals over the age of 20 will suffer some sort of disability in our lifetime. So it doesn't matter what your profession is, it applies the same way, because you could walk out, you could get an illness, right? People suffer all different types of illnesses all the time, and that requires them to go. Sometimes it's not just 3 months or 6 months, it could be a year. When I had my accident, when they told me 6 weeks, I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna be better way before that. It's been 3 years, and I'm just turning the corner to recovery, to being able to sit up for an hour, to be able to type. So all of that is factored in, and so it should not be considered. A lot of people think, oh, well, I work in a safe profession, so I think I'm good. There's so many other things that can happen to us that render us disabled.
Okay, so you don't have to be, working with your hands, building a house or digging a trench or something like that to need disability insurance.
Correct.
You mentioned short-term and long-term. I just want to
Yeah.
circle back around to this, because this is, I think, an interesting distinction. Do you get short-term disability insurance as well as long-term disability insurance?
Yeah.
Both?
Yeah, and I
Bundle
think
them? How does that work?
we should make that distinction. So I want to start by saying a lot of states do not mandate disability insurance as a benefit for employees. However, there are some states that mandate short-term disability. And essentially what short-term disability is, think about if your wife goes on maternity leave, she's out of work for 3 months or 6 months, her employer may cover that disability. If you're a teacher, your organization, your union, however you are compensated, they may cover that short-term disability. But it's also important to note that they may not cover 100%. What they may say is, for the first 4 weeks, you'll get 100%. And then for the next 2 weeks, for the next 2 months, if you stay out for 3 months, you're only going to get 60% of your salary. So there is that component of short-term. Typically, you'd see short-term disability ranging from 3 months to 6 months. So for example, in my case with my employer, my short-term disability ran for 6 months. And then once that ends, your long-term disability kicks in. For some people, that is not the case. They may get 3 weeks or 3 months or 3 months, and then they have to make up that difference, because if you get 3 months short-term disability and then your long-term disability kicks in at 6 months, there is that gap, right? You need to fill that gap.
Okay, so just for an insider thinking through this here, so we've got this gap of like 3 months. It is traditional financial wisdom to have an emergency fund of 3 to 6 months on hand of expenses. Would you think that getting an additional short-term insurance policy would be worth it if you have that emergency fund on hand to bridge that gap?
So short-term disability insurance, it turns out, is very expensive, probably more expensive than long-term, because if you think about, a lot of times if you become disabled, then relatively speaking, maybe in 6 months you'll be better, right? But in the first 6 months, so my suggestion would always be go with the emergency fund. Make sure you have 3 to 6 months of emergency fund, and then purchase the long-term disability policy, because at least if you have that coverage, it could help you. And the other thing that I want to note is that just because your long-term disability kicks in month 6, let's say that's what your employer offers you, it doesn't mean that on the first day of your next paycheck that you should have been getting that long-term disability income that you're going to get it, because they start a process to assess whether you are truly disabled. That's the insurance company, and that takes time. They have to get your medical records. Sometimes that's going to take some time to gather. So again, using me as an example, my long-term disability kicked in, let's say in February. I never got my first check until I think April.
Oh,
Yes. So it takes some time.
do they compensate you like
Yeah,
back a
you get
couple
it
months?
retroactive for sure, but in that time frame, you still need to cover yourself, right? Maybe there's some things you can put off, but there's some immediate things that you're going to need. So that's why even when we talk about that 3 to 6 months, it's really, if you just are operating from that base level and you become disabled, you find that that 3 to 6 months is not even enough.
All right, fair enough, fair enough. So having an emergency fund in place, being aware of what your short-term policy is, knowing if you have a long-term policy with your school, like what the disability options are from your employer, and then supplementing those as needed.
Yeah.
When you're looking at your policy, you mentioned like the percentage of your salary. Is there any other thing you should look at when you're deciding whether like how much of a supplement you're going to need?
Yes. So the first thing that you would want to do is you go to your employer once you listen to this podcast and say, "Hi, I'm interested," your HR, "I'm interested in finding out if I have a long-term disability," because not everyone offers it. And if they say yes, ask how much it is, when does it start? If you become disabled, when does it start? You might also want to ask about your short-term disability, not might. I would suggest that you also ask about your short-term disability as well. Ask them, what percentage you get if you become disabled, when does it kick in, when does it end? And you do the same for your long-term disability policy as well. It's really important that you know, because if they come back to you and they say, okay, you have a long-term disability policy, it's going to kick in at the beginning of month 6, and you get 60% of your salary, bonus is not covered, and it lasts only 3 years, then when you go out and you're getting a supplemental policy, you're going to do your little calc and say, okay, if I get 60% of my income, when you go out to an insurance company to purchase a policy, they may not cover you for the 40%. They may cover you for a little less than 40% because they're always suspicious that we're trying to game the system. And if you're getting 100% of your income, you might not be incentivized to go back to work. So let's say they're going to cover 30% or 35%. So you're going to now go to them and do some research, find reputable companies. I'm always like AAA rated companies are important. And then think about what your needs are going to be during that time frame. For example, you could say, and finance is going to come into play too. How much can you afford? So you'll want to know, okay, I want 35% or 40%. You work with the agent to decide on what percentage. And then you want to know over what period of time do I want to purchase this policy, because they do have 5 years, 10 years until you're age 65. All these different terms of these policy the premium is going to vary based on the term of the policy, and then you want to know if you have pre-existing condition, will that preclude you from getting that policy? Sometimes mental health, they may say we'll only cover you for 24 months if you have a mental health issue. So you want to understand that too. So there is, like lots of things that you think about to ask them to ensure that they're putting together a policy for you that's going to work for you if you were to become disabled.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. That was a ton of information. I just have a few thoughts I want to make sure that I share here. So we've got, you get, let's say 60% of your income from your insurance. If your expenses are not 100% of your income. If you are able to keep your expenses low,
Right. Yeah.
then you obviously won't need as much
Yeah.
of an insurance, right? So I wouldn't ask for the full, 35% if you're only spending 80% of your income. Maybe you only need 20,
Correct.
or if you're able to even get it lower and bring your income down even further, like you can try and keep that as low as possible. That will keep these premiums down as low as possible when you're making the choice on which insurance to get. And then just another thing I want to remind everyone, this is coming out around the time of open enrollment for your employer, most likely. So just insurance is on the mind. It's the time to do this. Don't put this off right now. Insurance is what's coming up. So make sure that you are enrolling in the various insurances that you need, and you're doing that research right now, even if it's a particularly busy time of year for you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I got another question, because I'm trying to always keep teachers in mind. So we have this interesting problem as teachers, that we have a pension, which is not a problem, but no one else really does. So no one really talks about it and the effect of pensions on the way these things work. And pensions are based on the final years that a teacher's working.
Right.
That's how they're calculated. So if you become disabled before you reach retirement, will that affect your pension take-home pay because you're on disability? Or like how does disability relate to your income in that way? If you
Yeah, it's definitely going to affect your pension, because if you think about, well, first you have to think about what happens if you become disabled, right? If you're disabled for, let's say, for a year, your employer might say, I'm not going to hold your job anymore. So now you will no longer be employed by at your school, right? So now when does your pension end? You're no longer employed, you're no longer accumulating on your pension. So that's already gone. And a lot of times when you're employed by a company, you become disabled. Many of them, as a courtesy, will hold your job for a while, but eventually they have to replace it, especially if there is a very high likelihood that you cannot return to work after a year. So then there goes your pension that's now affected. And if you can go back to work, then obviously you now can start rebuilding and accumulating on your pension. If you remain on long-term disability, the likelihood that you're going to continue to be employed by that employer is gone. So if you want to think about it that way as a teacher, you no longer have a job with that company. Yeah, so your pension stopped accumulating there based on your income. Now it's just growing.
Right. Okay. I hadn't even thought about the loss of the position anymore. So,
Yeah.
I mean, this will probably depend heavily on the teachers' union that most teachers are part of, because, unions have all their different rules about hiring teachers and things like that. But it's definitely something to consider how this will affect it. And you might need to have something in your back pocket, some additional retirement savings, just
Yeah.
in case, because as you're getting closer to that pension time, you might think, I'm going to work 35 years, but then you get disabled at your 30. That will quite drastically alter your final 3 or 5 years of salary, whatever it is they're averaging off of, because those last few years are your highest paid years.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things that teachers can do as well, because I know with union, there's also that little uniqueness with what happens. And what a union may say is, okay, so yes, you are no longer employed by this particular school district, but we will rehire you if you are able to continue to work. And so obviously, if you go back and you start another job, then your pensions start building again. So it's going to come down to whether or not you can continue to work.
Yeah, that's a rough go. Okay, so maybe we've convinced some teachers here that they need to understand the long-term disability insurance. They want to try and figure it out so that way they can be covered. Are there any important technical terms that they need to understand when they are shopping their policies? Or, I mean, like we've already talked about, just the term, the amount you're going to get paid. But is there any like little nitpicky details that people kind of gloss over when they're looking at the whole sheet of information that they might need to know?
Yeah, so pre-existing condition is one that I mentioned before. Look back period is another thing that I want to talk about, because look back period is where, let's say you're on short-term disability, and I like to use my case as an example because it's like real life and you could kind of see what happens in my case. So before I had the car accident, I had taken short-term disability, and the way my job insurance was is you get 6 months short-term disability. And then next year you get, if you become ill again, you'd get a 6 months. Well, a lot of companies, including my job, changed the policy, and it happened right when I became disabled. So what they did instead is that they said, okay, you had taken time off for disability prior to your car accident. So now that you have the car accident, we're going to look back 1 year and see how much short-term disability time you took off during that year. And you can only take the remainder of that time. So I had 6 months short-term disability, and I had taken off only 2 weeks remaining. If they didn't have that look back period when I had the car accident, I would have my full 6 months short-term disability. Because that year they changed it, so then they looked back the year and they said, nope, you only get 2 weeks. So that's another thing that you definitely want to look for in your policy to make sure that you're not having that kind of issue, because again, that's when it will come back to having the emergency fund and making sure that your emergency fund is sufficient to cover what you need. There's also a lot of other technical terms. I don't know if there's any that you want to throw out of me, but for example, they may say we have an elimination period, and the elimination period would be how I talked about. You have to wait 6 months before you can get the insurance. And they may say this is the maximum. So talk about limits, like this is the maximum that we're going to insure you for. Then other very technical terms that come into play is like own occupation or any occupation. And what that means is when you become disabled, they're going to ask this question. Okay, are you fully disabled, and can you work in your own occupation? And if you cannot work in your own occupation, the policy may say, for the first 12 months, if you can't work in your own occupation, we will continue to pay you. We will consider you to be fully disabled. After that time frame, you will need to find a job in another occupation. And the reality is they don't really care how much that job pays. So can you work in another occupation? And if you can work in another occupation, then they will say you're no longer disabled and we will no longer pay you. So in my case, for the insurance that was offered from my job, they had that rule which says own occupation, and it was 12 months. So for the first 12 months, I was considered fully disabled. You show all your medical records, your doctors continue to opine that you're fully disabled. Then when I got to the 12 months and they reevaluated me, they said, no, everything remained the same for me. My hand was numb, my leg was numb. I couldn't type, and that's a lot of what I did in my profession. So they came back and they said, we think, and I worked as corporate vice president in accounting policy and sort of those kind of policy roles. They said, we think that you could find a job as a corporate vice president in another company, and therefore you're not considered disabled anymore, and so we will not pay you anymore. And so they discontinued my disability, and then you have to go through the process of appealing it and sometimes even going to court to demonstrate that you are in fact still disabled, nothing has changed, and your doctors have said that. And so any occupation and own occupation is one of those areas where they will get to that point where they will say you can find another job and we're going to stop paying you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Insurance just always
Oh.
shocks me.
And I want to add that, so I had a supplemental policy which I had purchased on my own. they never cut me off. So unfortunately, the policies that are offered by your employer, you would think that that would be the one that would protect you more and would be less onerous. But unfortunately, the reality is that that's the one that will cut you off the fastest. And they are under what's called ERISA, Employment Retirement Insurance Security Act. And so insurance companies are like the second biggest lobbyists in the government, in Congress. And somehow they were able to get these sweet deals where they are basically protected from a lot of things that you would think would be common sense. That if you have someone who's still disabled, all the doctors are opining that you're still disabled and all of that, that you would be protected. But unfortunately, it's not the case.
We're used to that as teachers. We have a 403B, which is not covered by any fiduciary rules. It's not good. We got some problems in that regard that we're trying to do. And they have a large lobby keeping it that way as well in the 403B space. I had a question that I forgot that I was going to ask you. I'm assuming that the 6 months before your long-term disability kicks in starts 6 months after you've filed for disability, correct? Not from the event, but from when you've said I am starting my disability, like I am.
Yes. And theoretically, those could be the same, right? Like if you become ill, so you can no longer work, you file for disability. And yes, then 6 months from that. But let's say you were sitting at home, and you kind of feel like you're not well, but then your doctor diagnosed you with something. So you get the diagnosis, you go on your short-term disability. And then at that point, after 6 months, or if it's 3 months, it's going to vary again across employer, which is why it's important that you understand. But yeah, then the 6 months is when it kicks in.
Yes, I wanted to point this out because like it can be really tempting to be like, oh, I'll get better soon, and you stumble along with taking some time off or this or that. But if you want that long-term disability to kick in, you're going to have to apply for the short term first for that to begin the clock towards that 6 months for then the long term. So if you feel like you've hit a disability point, getting that started now to protect yourself from not hurting yourself more or putting yourself in more danger is really important.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm not sure how it works for teaching, but like for my employer, after I was ill, not just me, just the policy. If you're ill, let's say for 7 days, right? And it's like something that's not just like, okay, I have the flu or something like that. They'll start talking about short-term disability. And so, okay, should you be on short-term disability? And so the clock starts, like sometimes it's almost like they force you in a way to say, okay, short-term, and then that starts the clock.
That's good. At least someone's trying to look out for you in that regard. All right, just got one more question for you before I go into the last questions I usually ask all of my guests. When someone wants to get short-term or long-term disability insurance, where do you go for that? Because like when I want home and car insurance, I go to my insurance guy. Is that the same place I go for long-term disability, or is there a special broker for that, or like how do you find the best and honest person to guide you into getting the right thing for you?
Again, it's doing your research. You do go to an agent. I always say go to 3 different people. Once you've done your research and understand what your needs are, because they will try to sell you any policy with the highest premium, right? And that's not always to your best benefit. So some of the things that I talked about, those are some of the things that you're gonna assess. As you said, Shaun, do you need 80% of your income covered? Do you need 90%? What that's going to look like. So you come up with a dollar amount of coverage that you think that you will need, and then you're going to put a list of questions together that you want to start asking them in terms of ensuring that you get the right policy. Like one of the things that I think is really important to ask too is, do I get a waiver? So if I become disabled, I don't have to pay my long-term disability policy anymore until I'm no longer disabled. So even asking simple questions like that, and then, asking about the pre-existing condition, asking about any occupation and own occupation and how that works. What happens if you work part-time? What happens if you think you were better and then you relapse and you become ill again? all of those are some of the things that you want to think about. And if you have a good agent, like they'll say certain things to you and you can kind of say yeah or no, like, yeah, I don't think that's beneficial. I remember when I did my policy, my agent said one of the things that you can do is that you can do like an inflation, a rider, where every year your policy increased by a certain amount because obviously inflation is going up, your income's going up. And I said, okay, I'm gonna go along with the rider. And each year I would get a notification about this rider because your policy premium is going to increase. It's not significant how much it increases by. But I would say to myself, oh my God, I'm never going to use this policy. I should just cancel this rider. But I always was too lazy to cancel the rider. And I'm glad I didn't because when I did become disabled, I needed every dollar that I could get. And I was like, thank goodness I didn't cancel it. And I also had the waiver where I no longer have to pay into my policy until I resume working.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. You've shared so many different, nooks and crannies to look in. It's so easy to get sold when you're buying something like insurance, because it's such a technical field that you can miss the important things. Even when you were talking about like putting money into retirement in a 403b, like I said, we don't have that fiduciary coverage. It really is easy to get sold into a product that's not in your best interest.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
usually these people are just doing their job. They're not like maliciously trying to fleece you, but they just are just doing what they think is gonna, it's not their money that's going into the premium. They're like, yeah, this is gonna give you a bunch of coverage, like you should take it. So just be aware that you need to balance this in your own financial situation and not just take whatever the salesperson says and figure it out. So you need to have that baseline understanding of these things that we're talking about before you go talk to the expert that's going to help you buy the insurance policy.
Correct.
Okay, so I've got 2 more questions for you. Same questions I ask all of my guests. First one is, what is your number 1 tip for teachers to have a richer wallet, classroom, and life?
Yeah, so this is advice I would give to teachers and anyone else, but for teachers, I feel like it's important that you know how much you have coming in and how much you're spending. And that should include, I know a lot of teachers, they buy supplies for their students and it's not something that they probably include in their budget, right? But at the beginning of the school year and even throughout the school year, they're spending, which is so unfortunate. But also include those things in your budget as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is pay yourself first. I know like things are so expensive and sometimes we just feel like we can't afford it, but it's very, very important that you take a sum of your money and automatically have it going into a separate account, preferably like a high yield savings. And then once you learn to invest, you could invest it, but pay yourself first so that your money can grow and work for you. And 3, protect what you've worked for. So we've been talking about long-term disability insurance. That's just one insurance, but there are other types of insurance as well that you can use to protect your income. And I think lastly, teachers are so skilled in so many different areas, and to get a richer wallet, to get a richer life, and if you're not completely burnt out, find something that brings you passive income that's going to help you also to build wealth, because for most of us, our salary alone is just not sufficient. And so we have to find other ways. And it might be something that just find something that you're very passionate about and use that to generate some income. Teachers, I admire teachers so much because I feel like there's so many different skill sets that you naturally have just from being a teacher. And if you can hone in on one of those skill sets that you really love and just go out and figure out how do I monetize this, and that's a great way to also have a richer wallet.
Those were a lot more than just one. Wonderful tips. You're speaking my language. I've said all of those things myself. I think that they are fantastic tips. Thank you for sharing those. Last question, if a teacher wants to connect with you, ask you a question, where can they find out more about you?
Yeah, so I have a website, growyourwealth10x.com. They can definitely connect with me there. I'm also on LinkedIn at Tanya Taylor, CPA, MBA, and I'm on Instagram at growyourwealth10x.com. I would also encourage them to watch my TED Talk, which I did on long-term disability, which I think is very eye-opening for a lot of people as they're starting to hear, because this is not a conversation that we have, long-term disability, who wants to have that? So it's a quick 15 minutes listen, because it could change your life tremendously if you really start understanding the impact that long-term disability could have on you, but if you're prepared, how that could just help you to have a richer wallet, continue to have a richer wallet, and continue to live the life that you want to live.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tanya. This has been a wealth of information. I've really appreciated having you on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and I hope that it will be beneficial for your audience.
Yes, thank you. Now, for listeners, if you would like to get all those links for her website, her TED Talk, and all that, you can go to teachermoneyshow.com/podcast, and all of the show notes for all the shows are there. And please tell a teacher friend about this show to help grow the show and bring other people into the knowledge of how to grow their wealth as a teacher and how to get the insurance that they need to get themselves covered. Thank you for listening.
Are you worried you won't have enough money to retire? Or maybe you just don't know how you're going to get out of all of this debt. Whatever your situation is, I can help you. Go to teachermoneyshow.com/guest and fill out the form there. And you can come on the show for free coaching, or we can meet one-on-one to discuss your needs. I look forward to talking to you.